Britain didn't lose its empire in a war. It lost it in meetings. No explosions, no invasions, just quiet rooms, quiet signatures, and deals most people have never even heard of. And that's the part nobody tells you. Because if you grew up learning history the normal way, you were taught that Britain won World War II, that the empire faded naturally, that colonies simply walked away, and Britain politely let go. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Empires don't just collapse out of kindness. They collapse when something forces them to. And what forced Britain wasn't defeat on the battlefield. It was debt, agreements, and promises made when the empire was desperate and bleeding cash. If this sounds like some far-fetched theory, it isn't. Every part of this story is written down, signed, archived, and quietly ignored. These weren't secret in the sense of being hidden. They were secret in the sense that nobody ever explains what they actually did. So today, I want to show you how the largest empire in human history was slowly sold off. Not to enemies, but to allies, one agreement at a time. And once you see how it happened, you'll never look at World War II or the modern world the same way again. What people think happened. Let's start with a version of history most of us were taught. Britain wins World War II. The Nazis are defeated. Europe is saved. And after all that sacrifice, Britain simply steps back. The empire fades. Colonies gain independence. The world moves on. But here's the problem. That version skips the most important question. Why would the most powerful empire in human history suddenly decide to give up control over nearly a quarter of the planet? Empires don't do that. Not voluntarily. Not without pressure. And yet, within just a few years of victory, Britain loses India, Palestine, huge parts of Africa, and its position as the financial center of the world. That's not a gentle decline. That's a collapse. So instead of asking what happened, we need to ask something more uncomfortable. What changed behind the scenes? Britain, before the war. An empire built on money. To understand the fall, you first have to understand how powerful Britain actually was. Before World War II, Britain wasn't just another European country with colonies. It was the system. London was the financial heart of the world. The pound sterling was the global currency. International trade moved through British banks. If you wanted to do business, real business, you did it in pounds. This wasn't just political power. It was economic gravity. And the empire wasn't held together by soldiers alone. It was held together by cash flow. Colonies sent raw materials to Britain. Britain processed them, financed them, insured them, shipped them back out. Money flowed in one direction. Control flowed in the other. As long as that system worked, the empire worked. And, for decades, it worked extremely well. The war changes everything, then came World War II. And almost overnight, Britain's financial strength turned into its greatest weakness. Wars are expensive. Global wars are catastrophic. Britain wasn't just fighting in Europe. It was fighting in North Africa, the Atlantic, Asia, and the Pacific. Ships had to be built. Planes had to be replaced. Soldiers had to be paid, fed, and transported. And here's the key point most people miss. Britain was paying for this war up front. Gold reserves started leaving the country. Foreign investments were sold off. Overseas assets were liquidated just to stay alive. Imagine running a business by selling off the building, then the equipment, then the land, just to pay this month's bills. That's what Britain was doing. By the early 1940s, The empire wasn't running out of courage, it was running out of money. Selling the future to survive the present. This is where desperation creeps in. When a country is desperate, it stops negotiating from strength. Britain began trading long-term power for short-term survival. Gold shipped across the Atlantic. Investments cashed out. Strategic leverage quietly handed away. And this didn't happen because Britain was stupid. It happened because Britain had no choice. Germany wasn't defeated yet. Japan was expanding, and Britain couldn't afford to stop fighting. This is the moment where the empire's fate quietly shifts. Not with a speech, not with a battle, but with a realization. Britain could no longer finance the war on its own. And that realization opened the door to the agreements that would change everything. The ally with the money. There was only one country left with the resources Britain needed: the United States. America hadn't suffered the same destruction. Its factories were intact. Its gold reserves were growing. And most importantly, America understood something Britain didn't fully grasp yet. This war wasn't just about defeating enemies. It was about deciding who would run the world afterward. So when the United States stepped in to help, it wasn't charity. It was strategy. And Britain, bleeding and exhausted, walked straight into it. Where this is headed. From this point forward, every major decision Britain makes will be shaped by one thing: dependence. Dependence on American supplies, dependence on American finance, dependence on American approval. And once an empire becomes dependent, it stops being an empire. In the next part, we're going to look at the first major agreement that locked Britain into this position. One that's often described as generous help, but in reality marked the beginning of the end. The first chain. Lend-lease isn't what it sounds like. By 1941, Britain had a serious problem. It was still fighting, still holding the line, still refusing to surrender. But financially, Britain was on life support. That's when the United States stepped in with something that sounded almost miraculous. Lend-lease. On paper, it looked generous. America would supply Britain with weapons, food, fuel, ships, everything needed to keep fighting, without immediate payment. No cash up front, no interest rates, no deadlines. And this is usually where the story stops. But that's not how power works. Because Lend-Lease wasn't free help, it was conditional dependence. Britain could no longer fight the war on its own terms. It could only fight as long as America allowed it to. And once that happens, the leverage quietly shifts. Why Lend-Lease was a turning point. Here's the key thing to understand. Before Lend-Lease, Britain still had options, painful options, but options. After Lend-Lease, those options disappeared because Britain stopped being a financially independent power and became a client. Weapons were no longer British-made decisions. Supply lines were no longer British-controlled. Strategic priorities now required American cooperation. And when the war ends, and it always ends, debts don't disappear. They transform. Reference you can lean on while writing. U.S. Lend-Lease Act of 1941. Congressional records, post-war settlement clauses. The war isn't over, but the future is already being decided. Here's where things get uncomfortable. While soldiers were still dying, while cities were still being bombed, the future world was already being negotiated. Quietly. In documents most people have never read. And the most important one came next. The Atlantic Charter. Words that undermined an empire. In 1941, Britain and the United States signed something called the Atlantic Charter. It wasn't a treaty. It wasn't legally binding, which is why it slipped under the radar. The charter laid out a vision for the post-war world: freedom, cooperation, peace. And buried inside it was a phrase that sounded harmless: self-determination. Every nation, it said, had the right to choose its own future. Now pause for a moment. Britain ruled over hundreds of millions of people who had never been given that choice. India, Africa, the Middle East. With one signature, Britain agreed, at least in principle, that empire rule was no longer morally defensible. And once that idea is written down, you can't erase it. Why Britain signed anyway? So why did Britain agree to this? Simple answer: because it needed America. America wanted a post-war world without old European empires dominating global trade. Britain wanted weapons, fuel, and survival. This wasn't a negotiation between equals. It was a negotiation between a drowning empire and a rising superpower. And Britain made the calculation that it could deal with the consequences later. That was the mistake. Ideals as pressure, not promises. Here's what makes the Atlantic Charter so dangerous. It didn't force Britain to give up its empire immediately. It did something smarter. It turned empire into a moral liability. From that moment on, every independence movement could point to Britain's own signature and say, "You agreed to this." And America could apply pressure without firing a shot. No invasion, no threats, just reminders. The empire is still standing, but it's hollow. At this stage, Britain still looks powerful on the map. Red territories everywhere, flags still flying, governors still in place. But underneath, something has changed. Britain no longer controls global finance, its own wartime supply lines. The moral narrative of empire power hasn't vanished. It has shifted, and the final shift is about to be locked in, not through ideals, but through money, setting the stage for the real takeover. As the war nears its end, one question dominates everything: who will control the world's financial system? Britain assumes it will regain its position. After all, it always has before. But America has a different plan, and it puts that plan into motion at a quiet conference in New Hampshire, while the war is still being fought. In the next part, we're going to look at the agreement that replaced the British Empire, not with armies, but with a currency, and why Britain never recovered from it. Bretton Woods. When the world quietly changed hands. In 1944, while the war was still raging across Europe, representatives from 44 countries gathered in a quiet town in New Hampshire. The meeting was called Bretton Woods. There were no parades, no headlines, no sense of drama. And yet, this meeting would do more to reshape the world than most battles ever fought. The goal was simple on paper: prevent another global depression, stabilize currencies, and rebuild after the war. But the structure of the system revealed the real winner before the war even ended. The end of the pound, the rise of the dollar. For decades, the British pound had been the center of global trade. That ended at Bretton Woods. The new system tied world currencies to the US dollar. And the dollar itself was tied to gold. Britain's currency, on the symbol of its empire, was pushed aside, not banned, not attacked, just replaced. From that moment on, global trade, loans, and reserves flowed through American institutions. Britain was no longer the referee. It was a participant, playing by rules it didn't write. Reference note for your writing: Bretton Woods Agreements, IMF and World Bank Founding Charters, 1944. Why Britain accepted the new system. This is where people often assume Britain was naive. It wasn't. Britain accepted Bretton Woods because it had no leverage left. Its gold was gone. Its economy was exhausted. Its empire was restless. Rejecting the system would mean isolation, and Britain could not survive alone anymore. So it signed. And with that signature, centuries of financial dominance quietly ended. The war ends. The bills arrive. When the fighting finally stopped in 1945, Britain expected relief. What it got instead was reality. Lend-Lease ended almost overnight. Supplies stopped. Support vanished. The financial cushion disappeared. Britain was suddenly exposed, weak, indebted, and dependent. And once again, the United States stepped in with an offer. The 1946 Anglo-American loan. Help with strings attached. In 1946, America offered Britain a massive loan. At the time, it sounded like salvation, but buried in the agreement were conditions that would devastate the British economy. The most important one? The British pound had to be fully convertible into US dollars. That meant anyone holding pounds could demand dollars in exchange, and when they did, Britain couldn't keep up. The result was immediate. Capital fled, reserves collapsed, confidence evaporated. Within months, Britain faced a financial crisis that confirmed what was already true. The empire was finished. Reference note: Anglo-American Loan Agreement of 1946, Convertibility Clause, Bank of England records. The dominoes fall. Once Britain lost financial control, everything else followed. India gained independence in 1947, not because Britain suddenly changed its morals, but because it could no longer afford control. Palestine followed, then large parts of Africa. Maintaining empire required money, troops, infrastructure, and political leverage. Britain had none of it left. The empire didn't collapse in one dramatic moment. It unraveled, quietly, logically, and fast. Not defeat, replacement. Here's the most important thing to understand. Britain wasn't destroyed, it was replaced. Its role as global banker, its role as trade enforcer, its role as system manager, all of it passed smoothly to the United States. No invasion needed. No occupation required. Just agreements. Was this inevitable? Or engineered? So was this planned? Did America deliberately dismantle the British Empire? The answer is more subtle and more revealing. America didn't need to destroy Britain. It simply built a system that Britain could only survive by joining. Once inside that system, Britain could never dominate it again. That's not conspiracy. That's strategy. The world we live in, now the dollar system we live under today, didn't appear by accident. It was designed. The institutions that shape global finance, the IMF, the World Bank, were born from this moment, and their foundations were laid on Britain's decline. The empire didn't fall in battle. It signed itself out of power. Final reframe. Britain won the war, but it lost the peace, not because it was weak, but because it was broke. History doesn't always belong to the strongest army. Sometimes it belongs to the strongest balance sheet.